Hi guys, I hope you're doing really well. My name is Sarah and welcome back to What the Horror, the channel where we talk about horror movies old and new. So today we are taking a look at Smile, which was released earlier this year, September in the US, and I believe later in the UK. I mean, it usually is later in the UK. And a few of you guys have asked me to talk about Smile and wanted to know my thoughts on it. So I finally sat down and watched it when it hit streaming, and here we are with a plot breakdown and a deep dive into the movie. I feel I should give you guys a spoiler warning for this episode because it is a deep dive and plot breakdown, so we'll be talking about lots of spoilers, covering lots of spoilers, and I also want to give a trigger warning just because of some of the movie's content. Not that I'll be going into too much detail with those particular aspects, as the YouTube gods wouldn't like me doing that, but to talk about the film as a whole, I do have to touch upon them. Smile was written and directed by Parker Finn in his featured directorial debut, but what I didn't know is that Smile initially began as a short film, also written and directed by Parker Finn, called Laura Hasn't Slept, released in 2020. In March of 2020, the short had won the Special Jury Recognition Prize for South by Southwest's Midnight Short category, and in June of the same year, Paramount Pictures asked Finn to write and direct a feature adaptation. Smile was filmed on a budget of $17 million and has made $213.9 million at the box office. This is an incredible year for horror. It just makes me so happy. After witnessing a bizarre traumatic incident involving a patient, Dr. Rose Cotter starts experiencing frightening occurrences that she can't explain. As an overwhelming terror begins taking over her life, Rose must confront her troubling past in order to survive and escape her horrifying new reality. The trailer for Smile led me to believe this was more of a young adult horror movie, like a PG-13 or a 12 or 15 for the UK. I'm trying to think of examples of what I mean. I guess films like Countdown or Slender Man, but that is not what Smile is. Smile is far darker in tone than I expected, and it takes itself really seriously. 2022 has seen a dizzying number of horror movies released, some phenomenal, some a little less phenomenal, but also a large number of movies that have had a divisive opinion and reception, and I was actually surprised to see that Smile is one of those films. There have been lots of people describing this as a terrifying movie, some calling it overhyped, and some who think it's simply derivative of other movies such as It Follows, The Babadook, and The Ring. While I agree that there are some familiar aspects within the movie, some tropes even, I wouldn't say that that means the movie is bad or predictable. I think Smile manages to deliver plenty of surprises and scares in its runtime. I understand that it's the idea of it being a chain curse moving from one person to the next that draws these comparisons to The Ring and It Follows. I do see the blatant similarities with The Ring. I haven't seen It Follows though, so I can't comment on that one, but the structure of the plot of Smile and The Ring are almost exactly the same. You have the skeleton plot breakdown of our main character being cursed, it's time sensitive, they go off to investigate the curse, with an X no less, there's a false ending, and then the real ending which has a tragic level to it. Smile's Act 1 opens with a flashback scene of what we discover to be a young Rose discovering the body of her mum in bed, who appears to have died from taking too many pills. We then move forward to present day, where we meet adult Rose Cotter, who works as a psychiatrist on a psychiatric ward in a hospital. We follow Rose at work for a while, giving us the chance to see that she's dedicated to her job, to the point of perhaps obsessive, but certainly overworked. We also get to meet some of her patients. First of all, we meet Carl, who is a recurring patient of Rose's, and then we meet Laura, who is the catalyst for the entire story of the film. It's important that the movie doesn't just jump into Laura, it's important that we meet Carl first, because this shows us Laura through Rose's eyes. Rose wants to help Laura, but ultimately she is at work and Laura is another patient, so Rose has her psychiatrist head on. We have Carl, who in a manic state is repeating his mantra of "I'm going to die, my mum is going to die, we're all going to die." And then, when Rose meets Laura, Laura, while stating that she is of sound mind and a PhD candidate, she is saying something similar to Carl. She's saying that she's going to die. And just to be clear, I'm not saying that all people who have mental illness say this or think this, and I don't think the movie is either. But what it is doing and why this is important is it's giving us and showing us a pretty valid and believable reason within the film why Rose and other people won't believe Laura's claims and later Rose's. The movie is setting up why these people who are cursed aren't believed, become isolated and ultimately fall victim to the monster, which is clever in another way because often when we are struggling with our mental health, it can feel a very isolating situation. The character of Laura is also important because this is us seeing the end of the story for one person, and we know that that story is then about to begin for Rose. It's really sad for Laura, who is portrayed so well by Caitlin Stasey. The line she says, "I'm going to die because no one will effing believe me," is just, it's gut-wrenching. But it's also sad for Rose because this is a window into her near future. We then get to see more of Rose's life outside of work by meeting her fiancé Trevor and her sister and brother-in-law Holly and Greg. These interactions help us form more of an idea of what type of person Rose is. Rose is overworked through her own choice, working 60 to 80 hours a week for months on end. There is an incredible level of dedication to her job, and we see in other aspects of her life that there is a level of order and control, from the way she dresses and does her hair, to how tidy her home is and how she controls her emotions around those in her life. We find out at the end of the movie that Rose has, for the entirety of her life, been carrying around guilt at the death of her mother. While it is shown that her mum did take pills, it is also revealed that a young Rose discovered her mum while she was still alive, and when her mum shouted at her to call for help, young Rose walked away, and so her mum was unable to be saved. Rose, in the hallucinated confrontation with her mum, explains that she didn't help her because to her mum was a monster. So for Rose, there is the monster haunting her because of the curse, but she has already been haunted her whole life by her mother, who she sees as a monster. Unlike the curse monster, no one could see how haunted Rose was because of her past, because she hid that part of herself. In her past relationship with Joel, Rose did start to let her walls down and share things with him, but she became afraid of him seeing the truth and him being afraid of that, and so she left him instead. This event in her childhood shaped the entirety of her life. It affects her relationship with her fiancé, her sister. It's why she does the job she does and why she works so many hours. By helping all of these people, it's making amends for not helping her mum as a child. I think there are a couple of messages to take away from Smile and themes within. Obviously, there is that of trauma, because that's what we're doing now in horror. We're using trauma as a MacGuffin. Not that I hate it if it's done well, which I think it is here, but Smile also is very much about mental health, about how we talk about mental health and the terms we use or the words that are thrown around, especially in a derogative way. How mental health can be viewed and how it isn't always something which is believed. There are plenty of people out there with the mentality of, if I can't see it, then it isn't real. And I know this because I've heard it out of people's mouths. So take this mentality of, if I can't see it, then it isn't real. That's basically what you have happening in Smile. If other people can't see the smiling monster, then the cursed individual is fine and clearly in no danger. With the character of Rose and the movie's title, Smile, the film is also exploring this thing or habit that a lot of people do, which is pretending to be okay or pretending to be more okay than they actually are or feel, because you don't want to bother people or cause problems for people, or you're worried about what they will say, do, or think about you. So, like Rose putting on her makeup and practicing a smile in the mirror to pretend she's okay, we put a mask on it to cover it. Some friends and I used to call it put your Barbie smile on, this idea of this false painted smile. Smiles Act 2 is where strange things now start happening to Rose. She's seeing things and getting spooky phantom calls, her cat goes missing, and her house alarm is triggered even though she's home alone. And under the weight of witnessing her patient die and all of the unsettling things that are happening to her, Rose begins to crumble under it. She decides to visit her old therapist and asks for medication medication to help with what she's feeling. Her therapist, though, doesn't think that this is the right option for Rose and suggests that they talk about what's going on instead. After an unsettling event at her nephew's birthday party, Rose decides to open up a little bit to her fiancé Trevor and tells him what's been happening. But when Trevor is no help, Rose decides to pay a visit to her ex, a cop who was involved in investigating Laura's death at the hospital. Together they investigate the deaths and discover that there is a pattern to them. Rose then becomes increasingly convinced she is going to die, and with nothing left to lose, has a few frank conversations with the people in her life, including her fiancé Trevor and her sister Holly. There is a clear contrast between Rose and her sister Holly. Holly is very concerned with running this perfect life and being the perfect parent. Holly wants to leave her childhood in the past, and that's almost where this desperation for perfection comes from. She empathizes with Rose that she found their mum, but she also feels as though Rose is still living in the past. There is also some guilt felt by Holly as well for leaving Rose with her mum when she moved away, and also anger from Rose at Holly for doing so, but in reality, it wasn't Holly's responsibility. She was older, yes, and so she was always going to eventually move out, but she was too young to take Rose with her. Two other contrasting characters on opposite ends of the scale are Trevor the fiancé and Joel the ex-boyfriend. We learn towards the end of the movie that Rose, in her relationship with Joel, felt that she could let her walls down a little and open up to him, and in doing so she became frightened of him seeing the truth and seeing the true her and being afraid of what he saw. So in her relationship with Trevor, she now tries very hard to keep those walls up. She doesn't share anything with him to not repeat the same mistakes that she did with Joel, in her eyes. I honestly couldn't understand why she didn't tell him about this awfully traumatic thing that happened at work, but it does make sense once you know this. But Rose's decisions to keep the walls up and Trevor at arm's length actually works well for him, as Trevor is a guy who likes things to be okay, to be easy. He doesn't want problems or difficulties, so he never really pushes that hard to find out if she's okay. Whereas Joel, he goes to the hospital, her place of work, just to check up on her and see how she is after the death of Laura. And Joel is also the one who is willing to believe what Rose is saying and help her through it. When Rose does eventually decide to open up to Trevor and tell him what has been happening to her, he doesn't want anything to do with it. I get that some of what she's saying could be hard to believe, but under all of it, what Rose is doing is asking for help, and he dismisses it, saying he doesn't know what to do with what she's saying. He calls her unhinged, and he brings her mum into it. He says something like, well, your mum was crazy, so maybe you are too. Maybe that's where you've got it from. I mean, I've not said that word for word, but that is essentially what he's saying. And what he does say is not okay. From the words he chooses to use, using her mum as an attack, and then just walking away and refusing to help because everything just isn't rosy at that exact moment. Okay, granted, he does call her therapist. That could be seen as helping, or it could be seen as passing the buck because he doesn't want to deal with it.
Yeah, you've got to help us, Doc. We've tried nothing and we're all out of ideas.
Smiles Act 3 is Rose coming to terms with the fact that she is either going to die or have to kill someone. She heads to the hospital where she works, and we watch as she attacks her patient Carl in front of her boss because, you know, you've got to have a witness to these things for the curse to pass on. But it turns out this was all another hallucination, and she's still just sat outside the hospital, having not attacked Carl. After a concerned conversation with her boss, Rose realizes that there is another way. She just has to be alone, and so she heads off to the place it all started, her childhood home. She has a final confrontation with the monster in the shape of her mum, and then in all of its monstery glory. We get the false ending and then the true ending, where it turns out that Rose does not defeat the curse. After all of her trying to understand it and trying to fight it, she instead dies and passes it on to her ex Joel. The antagonist or monster of Smile is a demonic entity which curses its victims. It seeks out people who have experienced a trauma at some point in their life. Perhaps this makes them more vulnerable to the monster. After it has possessed its victim, it seems to take pleasure in psychologically messing with them over a period of time, breaking them down further and isolating them from help before eventually making them either die or kill. But this event has to have a witness. Firstly, so that the entity can pass on to another host, but also because the entity seems to feed off of a person's trauma, and that is what keeps it alive. That is what sustains it. In regard to Smile's ending, I have seen a mixed reaction to it. I've seen some people love the ending. The fact that it's shocking and perhaps surprising, seeing as how our lead character, who we have followed the entire movie, just dies at the end. I've seen some not mention it at all, and so I assume that that is because they just accept it for the ending of the film. And I've seen some people say that they don't like it and found it disappointing or even hopeless. As in, if the movie is about trauma and mental health, then what is the message in the ending? That it's pointless to try? For me, on first viewing, I didn't mind the ending. I think I just saw it as an ending to a horror movie. It was one that was surprising, shocking, and horrifying. While horror movies have so much to say and we use the horror to say it, they are also a horror movie and so have gore, scares and theatrical elements that they also need to deliver to their audience. But if you're looking for a message, then perhaps the message is mental illness isn't always something that can be fixed and which will then just go away. It is more often an ongoing thing that you can learn to work with, like Rose's sister Holly. Perhaps Smile uses Rose as a cautionary tale that her way of dealing or not dealing with her trauma, where she refused to let people in, refused to let people help, and just buried everything deep down, didn't work in the end. Maybe Smile is saying, try to deal with trauma in a healthier way. So that's my plot breakdown and deep dive into Smile. I hope you enjoyed it. There was a lot of really positive feedback on my plot breakdown and deep dive into Barbarian, so I thought I would just stick to the same format for Smile. And honestly, this is how I prefer to talk about movies. I love the deep dives and the analysis. It's far more fun for me. So I think from now on that this is going to be the style I'm going to be focusing on. Lots of breakdowns, deep dives, analysis, and of course, truly horror. As always, don't forget to leave your thoughts in the comments. I may not respond right away, but I read them, I see them, and I enjoy hearing what you guys have to say. In the meantime, thank you as always for stopping by. I really do appreciate it. Take care of yourselves, and I will talk to you in the next episode. Bye, guys.